sip of coffee.
Sounds good. Okay, I can do a little bit of editing afterwards, so no worries. My internet, I'm keep getting some messages. Hopefully, we'll do this in one take, and it won't be too bad. So let's get started. So good morning, Dr. Whitzman. As you know, we received many questions following your presentation to the Affordable Housing Commission, and due to time constraint, we didn't get a chance to answer them all. However, Tatiana and I are very pleased that you've agreed to do this bonus Q&A session to get through the remaining questions, and I sincerely want to thank you for your time. So let's get right into it. Our first question comes from Barbara Adams, and Barbara said, Nova Scotia's Family Modest Housing Program helps modest income families get their first mortgage. When it was introduced, it sold out in a few months. It was successful, but the funds allocated to this program are limited, and this is true for all government programs. But what she wants to know is whether you support this type of government program.
In the abstract, I support homeownership support programs. Having said that, any kind of first-time home buyers program, and this is a variant on a first-time home buyers program, it's an exceptionally generous one, is not going to be the most efficient use of government funds. And again, you have to look at where you're targeting your interventions, where housing need is defined by the CMHC, folks who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing charges, people who are living in overcrowded situations, for instance, doubling up with another household or couch surfing, and with homes in poor repair. So who are the priority for that? And certainly data across the country shows that people who are earning less than 40% of the median income are the people who are most likely to be in housing stress. So the average house price in Nova Scotia is about $266,000. This is a $70,000 grant, which, as I say, is exceptionally generous. And that brings it down to about 200, a little under 200. And that should be affordable to an average income household. The average income in Nova Scotia is about $65,700. So that will help average income households who may otherwise be locked out of the housing market, depending on what housing market they're in. It won't help the majority of people who are in housing stress. It also won't keep the housing affordable in perpetuity, which is one thing that I mentioned. And some possible alternatives include limited equity home ownership. Habitat for Humanity has one model. There's a model in Toronto called Options for Homes, which is another model where the land is owned by a nonprofit company or a community land trust, and you buy basically a stake in the housing, and then you can sell a stake in the housing. That can take it to a lower household income level, but most importantly, you aren't paying for a sort of one-off benefit for one household that will not benefit anyone else. It keeps the land affordable in perpetuity.
Great. Okay, thank you, and thank you, Barbara, for the question. Our next question comes from Jill, and Jill asks, she says, while I like the idea of having more flexible land use requirements for nonprofit or affordable housing, i.e. reduced parking, increased density, she wants to know if you have any recommendations for addressing concerns of potential conversion to market or above market housing once developed, or in cases where the nonprofit dissolves.
Yeah, and again, as I mentioned in my talk, a lot of the inclusionary zoning or other PPP type agreements where you get a private developer to set aside a proportion for affordable housing, that is quite often for 10 years, sometimes it's for 20 years. And then that can convert to market really easily. We're seeing the impact of that with mortgages for instance, co-op housing, either having ended a few years ago or ending right now. So again, I would be pushing the notion of community land trusts whose purpose is to keep land affordable in perpetuity. If you look at, for instance, Milton Park in Montreal, that was a bunch of converted homes in central Montreal that have been affordable since 1980 and are continuing to be affordable for the residents, plus some extra land that they've been able to get since then. BC has a burgeoning community land trust that has about 2,300 homes right now and is rapidly growing. So I think looking into the notion of community land trusts as a way to keep land affordable in perpetuity is, again, a really efficient use of limited government funds.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jill. So our third question is regarding short-term rentals. So there's been a lot of media attention here and probably across the country in recent years on Airbnb and the impact of the short-term rental market. There is a group in the Halifax North End, for example, who argues that short-term rentals changes the fabric of the neighborhood, and they are concerns for their safety. Meanwhile, in many coastal communities, these short-term rentals take away from the limited rental supply. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for the locals to find rental housing, since property owners prefer renting their units to visitors, and they can yield a better return. So Christine Weber asked if you could share your thoughts around the need for more regulation of these short-term rental, or of the short-term rental market.
Yeah, as that question suggests, it's complicated. And a colleague of mine, or a former colleague in Australia, Nicole Gurin, has written some really excellent things about the what works in Sydney in Australia, which has a very low vacancy rate, may not be the same thing that will work with coastal communities. So I think we have to separate between people who are renting out part of their homes as an their own homes, their first homes, as a affordability mechanism, and investors who are speculating and making quite a bit of money through short-term rental. So as you may guess, the second one is problematic in my mind if you're looking at affordable housing, and the first one is understandable. So one thing to keep in mind is the easier you make it to have legal long-term rental of an accessory dwelling unit in your home, the less attractive short-term rental is. But short-term rental will generally give you more money than long-term. So what, for instance, the city of Toronto and many other cities around the world, San Francisco, Portland, et cetera, Paris, Lisbon, Barcelona, are talking about is a rule that you can only rent out one property. It has to be the property that you live in, and you have to live in it a minimum number of days. And I think in Toronto it's 180, which is sort of half the year. In San Francisco, it's more like 260, so you can only rent out for a short-term rental part of the year. Usually it's renting a room rather than a whole house. And that seems a bit harsh. That would be something that I'd recommend for a city like Halifax with a relatively low vacancy rate, because it's absolutely true that short-term rental takes long-term rental out of the market. In terms of holiday communities, there would have to be a slightly different sort of rule. And again, I mean, an affordable housing commission really needs to be careful about where it draws the boundaries. And I kind of draw the boundaries at second home rental, particularly in some communities where second home rental gets in the way of service workers in tourist towns who then can't rent. So I think you really have to look at the aims first and foremost. You want cheap rental in the community to be there and be affordable. You need to look at the rental rates. You need to look at people's incomes versus the average rentals, and then make a decision about short-term rental in that context. And as I say, people's first homes as a kind of principle should always take precedence over people's second homes, I would say.
It is a complex issue because we're also hearing from a lot of the businesses in those areas who complain that there's not enough units available for visitors or to keep visitors over for 2-3 days or longer period of time. So short-term rentals kind of help alleviate that issue. But what it shows is there's a greater need, both for tourism but also for locals who for rental housing in general.
Yeah, when short-term rentals blew up, which is really only about 10 years ago, most towns had a rule that you could operate a licensed B&B, and that was it. And there were some informal arrangements, but what Airbnb and other platforms did was take those informal arrangements and make them much easier, and there was no regulation whatsoever. So what I'm saying is that from the perspective of affordability, we've seen the impact and we need to look at some form of regulation, but it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation, and whoever's doing housing planning there needs to look at vacancy rates, needs to look at whether there's affordable rental available, and then act appropriately. But of course, you don't get a service job if there isn't tourism. So there needs to be some kind of mechanism where tourists can stay for a week. So that's the conundrum. It's not a simple one.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next question is from Bill McMullen. Bill was wondering if you were aware of any jurisdiction that has a completed and maintains an accurate census of rental stock. He believes the lack of such is of significant consequence. He points to the fact that at any point in time, there's capacity or vacancies that go unfilled because renters can't find them. And he also notes that planners and policymakers can't accurately quantify the problem or the gap between supply and demand.
Bill's spot on. And that does need to be one of the tasks going forward in terms of affordable housing. That has all kinds of implications. Look, New York City, and quite often it's places that have really bad affordability problems that come up with the best solutions because they have such big problems. New York City's been pretty good at keeping track of affordability of units of buildings, and also of flagging buildings that are at risk of being sold to investors and having a great deal of rent eviction or loss of tenants as a result of being bought by, say, real estate investment trusts. It does take a bureaucracy. I mean, it's not something that's going to happen voluntarily. It's not something that's going to happen without a certain amount of keeping track. In some ways, it would be easier to keep track in smaller towns where there's a limited amount of rental, but someone needs to be there and keep track. It is really essential to keep track of what's happening to the affordable housing stock, because again, we've seen the consequences of not doing that, which is that the loss of affordable housing has been so much greater than either new affordable purpose-built rental or new social rental. And I can't see that not being the case for a very long time. You'd really need some scaling up of both in order to avoid net loss of affordable housing. And really then the only way that you can track and arrest net loss of affordable housing is knowing what's where there's affordable housing, where it's being lost, and then taking steps to avoid or arrest the loss of naturally occurring affordable housing. But it's a great question, Bill.
Yeah, and the commission has struck a working group just focused on data and financial modeling, but the importance of having that information, because it's a real challenge, especially outside of
when
the
you're
census.
Looking at supply, there's the tip of the iceberg, which is like the 10% possibly of new housing that you'll be supplying over 10 years. And then there's 90% of already existing affordable housing and what's happening to that. So you can't look at supply and then, well, you could, but it wouldn't be a great idea to focus on supply and then just look at new supply as opposed to existing.
Right, absolutely. Great. Okay. Well, we're doing very well. We're almost at the end of our questions, and I'll save the last for Tatiana. But the next one is from our team. So one of the things that you've identified a need for gender intersectional analysis and sub-targets. Can you provide some best practice examples of how this has been done in practice to really focus attention on those most marginalized?
Yeah, there's some really good recent reports. BC Human Rights Commission did a great report, wasn't on housing, but was on disaggregated data. There was a great report out of the Homeless Hub last year on women in homelessness that kind of cut down on an intersectional basis. So it was also really good on Indigenous homeless and racialized homelessness and, LGBTQI2S homelessness. So there's some really great reports out there that are generating the numbers, certainly at the national level. But the question is really specific, which is what cities are taking a good track. And I'd say that when it comes to income category based, Vancouver's been doing a really good job since its 2017 plan at looking at supply and specifically housing targets, and also looking at what types of tenure and housing type are most appropriate for each housing target. I mean, you can't talk about home ownership for people who are earning less than $15,000 a year. So they've done some pretty good analysis at the city of Vancouver. I think when it comes to gender-based analysis, look, the city of Toronto has echoed the federal government in saying 25% of housing for women-based households. I'm still not sure what that statistic comes from, because it's like 60% of households in needs are women led, but okay, 25% is a good start. And they're starting to run it through their programs, for instance, the Rapid Housing Initiative, making sure that some of the 25% of the housing goes to women at risk of homelessness. So it's the only way that I can describe it is it's Rip Van Winkle, it's Sleeping Beauty, whatever fairy tale you want. For about 30 years, nobody was really taking responsibility for affordable housing. The federal government wasn't. A lot of, they downloaded to provinces. A lot of provinces went, wah, and downloaded it to municipalities. A lot of municipalities went, wah, so we're just sort of getting to the point where we're starting to take this very serious issue seriously. And one of the real challenges is just getting the data. I mean, the census doesn't have good data on racialized populations. It doesn't have good data on queer populations. It doesn't have good data. It doesn't even have good data on people with disabilities, which is a huge, huge marginalized risk group. And of course, there's different kinds of disabilities that need different kinds of housing. So we're just at the baby step stage, and maybe Nova Scotia can become a trendsetter.
Noted. Hopefully, hopefully this is an area that we know has garnered a lot of attention so far in the feedback that we're getting from the stakeholder engagement and also the conversations at the commission level. So it is top of mind for sure. Now, the next question is really around performance evaluation and improvement, but really kind of that partnership that we were talking about, but this time between government and nonprofit. So how can governments and nonprofit organizations, for example, do a better job with performance evaluation and improvement? We've talked about the significance and the importance of the role of the community housing sector. So how can we work together, government and nonprofit organizations?
Well, I see you have Steve Pomeroy speaking tomorrow, I believe, and he co-wrote a really good report on best practices from British Columbia and Quebec, which are really the two provinces that dropped the ball least on affordable housing when the downloading occurred in the 1990s from the federal government. So they both have a great deal of support. In Quebec, it takes the form of technical resource groups. It would be in English, GRTs in French, that help nonprofits at that critical stage of identifying land, putting together proposals, getting approvals, which are all the things that you need before you get funding to assist. So that's what Quebec does well. And BC Housing has also done that kind of really good work, particularly with Van City, which, although it's based in Vancouver, has certainly expanded to Ontario. It's a credit union where a big backbone of their business has been assistance to community housing providers. I did notice that the federal government set up a community housing transformation center that's based in Montreal, and that at least one BC group has gotten a grant to scale up or to look at scaling up their operations. So I'd say take a look at those good practices. I think that Ontario used to have good practices, but those fell apart around about 1995 when there was a change of government. And there are a lot of good practices out there, as well as the federal government in the 1980s had money to help capacity building in community housing foundations. But I've written a report on this specifically around women's housing that you can Google, which is about scaling up women's housing. I co-wrote it. And a lot of community housing service providers are very small, less than 100 or even 50 homes. And they have a service bent, which is great, but they don't have people on their board who have financial real estate background, et cetera. And one of the things we were trying to do in the report was look at some organizations that are just at that cusp of going, yeah, we're growing really quickly. We need to think about boards. We need to think about 10-year strategies that prioritize housing as opposed to service delivery. We need to look at our capital reserves, you know, all of those things that you need to do as you go from being a very small and niche service organization towards being a housing provider. And there are a lot of organizations out there that are there to help. But you know, including, I'm sure Nova Scotia has the equivalent of Nonprofit Housing Association. The BC Nonprofit Housing Association just cooks with gas. They're great. In fact, the co-op and the Nonprofit Housing Association have coupled together, and they're called Housing Central. They're in the same building and everything, and they provide great support. So it's sort of, as I say, I think BC and Quebec are a few years ahead because they're starting to build up that ecosystem of partnerships that are really important. And you need partnerships. You need partnerships between local government, nonprofit housing providers, finance providers, and sometimes private developers, and certainly the provincial government, in order to really tackle the scale of issues that everywhere across Canada are facing.
Thank you for that answer. This is at the forefront. This is a core priority for the province. In fact, Nova Scotia doesn't have a similar association, but we're pleased with the support from the Community Housing Transformation Center, who just actually launched a program in collaboration with St. FX University to look at some of the needs and how do we build the community housing sector. And so there is an engagement process that just started in parallel of the work of the commission to really look at the gaps and build a solution by the community housing sector for the community housing sector. And hopefully they'll have a chance to go through what Quebec and BC have laid before us in terms of experience and expertise.
I'm just going to tell a little anecdote, which I can do now that I'm out of Australia. When I was in Australia, the state of Victoria, and in fact, the Department of Treasury and Finance came to our group and said, okay, we want to really scale up social housing. The trick is we don't want to spend any money. Go. So we put together a report for them, and we said two things. One is land, which isn't really a direct cost. You can lease it and, you know, play with your balance sheet so that it doesn't look like a cost. It is going to be a huge game changer for some forms of nonprofit housing. And the other thing that you can do is capacity building. And again, there's always a cost. The cost isn't having officers who are working on it, but in terms of bang for your buck, that's going to be super, super important.
Excellent. Okay, well, for our last question, I'll turn it over to Tatiana.
Great, thank you, Stefan. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Whitzman, for taking the time on Friday and today. Your research is so helpful and your insights so helpful. I've been madly taking notes as you've been talking. My question is, if you could summarize sort of 2 to 3 key takeaways that you would see for Nova Scotia, given the mandate that's been given to the Commission, the Housing Commission, to develop recommendations focused on increasing access to and increasing supply of affordable housing in Nova Scotia, what would be your top 2 to 3 recommendations for areas of focus, based on everything you talked to us with the great examples from Canada, as well as other places like Australia? All that in mind, what would be your top 2 or 3 things that you say, you know, focus on these areas, everything else would be almost a nice to have. These are the key change drivers that Nova Scotia should focus on.
Right, so I'm a policy wonk and I read policy for a living. And look, it's actually McKinsey, a large global consultancy, that said housing is infrastructure. The best way to approach infrastructure is evidence-based policy. And in order to have evidence-based policy, you have to start off with a basic needs assessment and then asset assessment. So it's so important for Nova Scotia to come up with a clear, consistent definition of affordable housing and look at income categories, look at size of households. Again, it's not that that's an expensive thing to do or even a particularly difficult thing to do. We're just starting on a project that's funded by the CMHC to do needs assessments in BC. And at least in the first stage this year, it'll expand outwards in the next couple of years. It's hard. Very few people are doing it. Very few people are looking at not just the deficit number, but also the loss of affordable housing number and the population projection number, and then coming up with a strategy for the next 10 years. If you're not doing it that way, you're doing it by guesswork, you're doing it by mouthfeel, you're doing it by who you hear from. That's not a good way to do infrastructure planning. So that would be my number 1 recommendation with an exclamation point on top. The second thing I do is, and it's actually the corollary of part 1, is take a look at the assets you have. And the assets that you have very much include land, well-located lands. So again, come up with a definition of what you're going to call well-located land for affordable housing. Take a look at your land assets, take a look at maximizing your land assets. I think I mentioned lazy land in my presentation. So, you know, where do you have health centers? Where do you have land that for whatever reason you haven't been using, but it's well located, let's say associated with road allowances or something like that, and take a look at them and how they can be best developed for affordable housing, and definitely use community organizations as assets as well as developers, as well as finance, both social and mainstream finance providers. But when you're doing that, make sure that you're focusing on the population groups that need housing. I guess a sort of 2.5, it wouldn't even be a third, is set aside 10% for evaluation, because you're still figuring out what you're doing, everyone is. And, you know, you do a pilot, like for instance, modular housing, which was a pilot in Vancouver. You evaluate it, you go, that worked pretty darn well. And then you scale it up. And now it's scaled up across Canada. So needs assessment, take a look at your assets, set aside some money for evaluation, and you're not going to fix everything immediately, but that's a really good foundation.
On these words of wisdom, we want to thank you so much, Dr. Whitzman, for taking the time and the extra time to speak to us, speak to the commission. I know the feedback was fantastic following the presentation on the 19th, and I'm sure people will love the answers that you just provided us in this bonus webinar or extra time that we have with you.
No, they were really, really excellent questions. And I thank all of the people who asked those really thoughtful questions. And I think that the questions show and the turnout shows that you're on a really important issue and you're on the right track.
Well, that's great to hear, especially from somebody that has read all the policy papers or most of them anyway on housing and keep a finger on the pulse. So really appreciate, and we'll be happy to share with you the results of the work of the commission, and hopefully that some of your advice will transpire in the recommendations.
Great. I look forward to reading it. Keep up the great work, and lovely meeting you both.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.